Rip City Mornings.
All right, so the news came down yesterday morning, right in the middle of the show, that Mike Leach passed away at the age of 61, leaving behind a football legacy unlike any other. And I know we say that a lot, unfortunately, when people pass away, but he was truly one of one. Between the air raid offense, being able to build winners in Lubbock, Texas, and Pullman, Washington, and being, for the better part of 2 decades, maybe the best soundbite in all of college football. And our next guest knows exactly what I am talking about. She roamed the sidelines for the better part of a decade for the Pac-12 Network. Friend of the program, back on the big show, Jill Savage. Welcome to the show. Good morning. How are you?
Hey, Justin. I'm doing great. And I will say Mike Leach is absolutely one of one. How about a guy who never played college football, who had a law degree, who ended up revolutionizing the sport? I mean, truly leaving his mark on the game like no one else.
Yeah, I think he played rugby at BYU and on a club team, and then became obsessive compulsive about the strategies of not just college football, but of football, and then ultimately led him to some interesting spots, but really kind of made a name for himself with Tim Couch at Kentucky and then at Oklahoma, and then we saw as a head coach. And, you know, before we get into some of the interesting interactions that you have had with him, just in terms of football, we talk a lot about, you and I were both in Eugene in the Chip Kelly years, and kind of what that offense did to college football as we can see it everywhere now. I think you can kind of say the same thing for the air raid when you look at offenses across the country outside of a handful of places here and there. There is some sort of air raid sprinkled into nearly every offense in all of college football.
Absolutely, yeah. If they don't run the full air raid, then they run pieces of his system as well. And it's interesting you bring up Chip Kelly there, because I think that Mike Leach and Chip Kelly, they both understood what's going on inside the minds of a college football player's brain, as best you could, at least, right? Like, they know they have busy schedules. They have a lot to do. They're here, to play football and get an education. So let's make the football piece as easy as possible. Mike Leach would go out there. You could install his offense in 3 days. It was just repetitive practices, one after another, right? Like the 10,000 hours theory, where you're going to master something at 10,000 hours. Chip Kelly tried to make it as simple as possible. Mike Leach made it as simple as possible. And you see the results on the field. And that's why it's so easy to take bits and pieces of these offenses, because it's not super complex. Mike Leach had a tiny little piece of paper with his plays on it, Justin. It was like the essential, write it on the back of a napkin. That's all he had. He didn't care.
I mean, you see these dudes with the big laminated and the wristbands and the 1,000 plays in probably a gajillion hours of watching film. And then on the other sideline, there's Mike Leach, who probably in the middle of practice was giving some soliloquy about Blackbeard and the way he managed his his fleet of pirates. And he's got a tiny little 3x5 note card that you would bring in to cheat on your biology exam. It's that's my offense. And we're just going to keep running it until you're ready to be done.
Absolutely. And if you're not running it, the offense, when they get off the field, they're going to have to do push-ups. And then his quarterback is going to have to do crunches, because he's like, I want to keep your arms okay. Yeah. So you do crunches, quarterback. Everybody else doing push-ups. Drop and give me 20 right now.
Jill Savage joining us here on 620 Rip City Radio. She covered she worked the sidelines for the Pac-12 Network for many, many years, many interactions with Mike Leach. Let's go back to kind of the beginning. I was talking about it yesterday, and Jill, I don't know if people remember. I'm sure Washington State fans do, but just how bad Washington State was. From Bill Doba to Paul Wolf, they won 9 games in 4 years. Yeah. They were the absolute, if you think Colorado was a doormat this year, Washington State was the doormat of doormats at that time. And Mike Leach, who was kind of in football purgatory because of the lawsuit at Texas Tech, comes into Pullman, and not necessarily the first year. They won 3 games, but after that, all of a sudden, got a quarterback, they got an offense, they got a system figured out, and in 1 year took a team that was absolutely god-awful and took them to a bowl game and made them a contender in about 3 years in the Pac-12.
Washington State football would not be what it is today if Mike Leach had not showed up. Because when they hired Mike Leach, they said, we are opening up our checkbooks now for Mike Leach to come here. Donors, we need you to do the same. And that was really the time where the Washington State donor base decided, okay, we're either going to be a player or we're not. And that one single hire will forever change the face of Washington State football, because then it was keeping up, with the Joneses, the arms race in the Pac-12 where everybody started upgrading their facilities. None of that for Washington State would have been possible without the name and the gravitas, if you will, of Mike Leach coming in and taking over and saying, we are going to win. It's not going to be forever down the road. We are going to have a system that kids can understand, and we're going to put an entertaining product on the field for you.
All right, you and I have done this before on previous shows where we kind of do tales from the sideline. You held for a good chunk of time one of the more unique jobs in all of sports, which is that of a sideline reporter in college football, and you get the sometimes unenviable task of getting to do the halftime interview with a coach that may not be having that great of a day. Now you've got a couple of pictures up on your Twitter page of you interviewing Mike Leach on the sideline. I'm amazed that you got 4 pictures of him standing still, because I have a ton of memories of both.
It's my claim to fame, Justin.
I know you got him to actually stand still because, again, you and I both know Jessamine McIntyre, Washington State sideline reporter, who had to, get your steps in because he was jogging to the locker room if you wanted to get a question in. But what was your first interaction with Coach Leach, and what was it like?
I will be completely honest with you. When I had to interview Mike Leach the first few times, I'm like, oh my gosh, what is going to happen here? This is a head football coach who doesn't want to answer football questions. Justin, that's my job, right? Like, what are you going to be doing here? So at the first part of the Jill and Mike Leach saga, I was like, no, please, Washington State, don't win, because I don't want to have to interview Mike Leach after the game, because I never know what he's going to say. And then I got to know him a little bit more, and I put in the time to make it work with him. And at that point, I earned his trust. And everything from then on was different. Justin, there was one time, I don't know if you remember this, but there were a lot of Washington State football players getting arrested. And it was on the outside the lines, ESPN. And I remember, so Jessamine McIntyre, the Washington State sideline reporter, and I are good friends. And we would go back and forth like, hey, how are you guys going to approach it this week with all of the arrests going on in the program? And they said, oh, we're going to have meetings and decide all this. So I go to the Pac-12 network and I say, hey, guys, let's talk about this ahead of time. And they're like, no, we're going to be good. I said, oh, okay, great. So I know it's going to fall on my shoulders. They tell me an hour or two before my pregame interview, you have to go out there, and whatever Mike Leach says to you is what we're going to run with the game. That's going to be the whole story. That's going to be our quote. That's all we're going to have to be able to talk about this, because, the schools still own the Pac-12 network. And so I said, oh, no big deal, guys. We're just waiting for Mike Leach to comment on legal matters for his team to me, and that's what we're going to go with. But, Mike and I had such a good relationship that I said, hey, Mike, I'm not out to get you, but, I need a quote here. And he actually stood there and answered all the questions for me. And I thought, man, we have come a long way. But yeah, you're looking for the fun stories, and Justin, we have plenty of those as well.
Well, let's dive into that, because you sent me a clip yesterday in the middle of the show, and I had forgotten about it because, Jill, you know this, I'm a big goofball Oregon homer, and I've tried to black out the Lewis and Clark uniform game because both the uniforms were awful. Like, they put a topographic map on the uniforms again, maybe.
Yeah, and wasn't that a triple overtime win for Washington State?
Win. Everything completely went wrong. We learned that, like, outside of Vernon Adams, Oregon did not have a quarterback that year.
Yep.
Royce Freeman was the only thing moving the ball for the Ducks that day. But regardless, pregame, because Oregon had their tribute to Lewis and Clark. Oh, what an awful idea that was. And you, of course, knowing that you were probably going to get something, had to go and threw out the Lewis and Clark expedition question to Mike Leach.
I went and talked to my producer and I said, listen, Mike Leach isn't going to answer football questions, right? This is still back in that era. And he said, yeah, I'm with you. Continue. I said, okay, so I have this crazy idea. I'm going to ask him a question about Lewis and Clark, right? I don't know if he had written the Geronimo book yet or not, but we all know Mike Leach, huge history buff. He's going to talk about this more. Justin, he gave me a 3-paragraph answer to the Lewis and Clark question. He wouldn't stop talking. I'm laughing in my mind. I'm trying to listen and focus on what he's saying, but also I'm like, hey, studio show, you're welcome. For whatever the reaction is going to be off of this, I think that I've done my job. And that shows you the unique side of Mike Leach. Like, who else could say, oh, yeah, and then they picked up Sacagawea on the way, and Lewis and Clark. It was more on the water than it was by land. And he just kept going on and on and on. I'm like, we're getting a history lesson right here on the field of Austin Stadium before, a big Pac-12 football game.
Well, it was mostly on the water, and you had Sacagawea and her husband, but he wasn't talked about as much. But it's like, and that kind of goes to my next question, because I've always had this theory, right? Oh, Mike Leach, he's quirky, right? Yeah, he's quirky. He's a little bit out there. Jill, I've always believed he's quirky like a fox. This was, I believe,
100%.
all planned out because you and I and anybody else who has been lucky enough to work in sports media knows that football coaches' press conferences are paint drying, grass growing, boring. They are unless every once in a while you get a coach that goes off. For the most part, it's coach speak. Everybody's great. This opponent is tough. It's going to be a tough team. We had a great week of practice. It's boring. And Mike Leach didn't even want to talk about the boring stuff. And to break it up, you knew somebody, some TV reporter, some goofy radio guy like me, was inevitably going to ask Mike Leach about who would win between a bulldog and a grizzly bear, or some mascot, and then he would
the mascot challenge.
It was such a calculated move to I'm just going to act quirky. Somebody's going to take the bait every single time, and 20 minutes are going to go by, and I don't have to talk about football. It's brilliant.
Absolutely. And I kind of laughed, Justin, as Mike Leach moved on to the SEC, and ESPN and the SEC network is like, oh my gosh, have you heard him talk about weddings? And everybody on the West Coast is like, yeah, we heard that 5 years ago. But hey, way to catch on, ESPN. He's been doing this whole time. But yeah, I think that, his offense was fairly simple in his mind, right? He didn't have any adjustments that he would really make week to week. A lot of it he left in his quarterback's hands. He would say, think about it. You have an option on nearly every play for his quarterback. And so he's like, well, there's not that much that I'm going to be doing here on the sidelines week to week to make these adjustments and do these crazy things that you want me to talk about in press conferences. So instead, I'm just going to have fun with it. I'm going to be quirky. I'm going to say whatever I want to say. There was one time I was up in Pullman, and there were a ton of bees, Justin, just a ton. I don't know why. But I said, you know what? I bet Mike Leach knows why. So before we had our pregame interview, I said, hey, Coach, why are there so many bees? And this is weeks 1 or 2. And he knew exactly, the wind's coming in from here and this and that. And I'm like, I was just joking in my mind, saying, oh, he'll know the answer. But he actually did. He could talk intelligently on any subject that you would want. And that's what I will always remember about Mike Leach. That, and we would always have the commissioner's dinner around the media days down there in L.A., we would always go out to this fancy dinner, Justin. It was at Mastro's in Beverly Hills, a private room, seafood towers, drinks, whatever you wanted, right? Mike Leach, everybody's dressed in a suit and a dress, whatever. Mike Leach comes in his Key West t-shirt and cargo shorts. Every single year. And then, when we got to Mastro's, they would hand him a suit jacket, and they'd be like, sir, if you could please put this on. So there's Mike Leach walking around where he would drink, and just, the Key West t-shirt underneath the very nice Mastro suit jacket that he would be forced to wear. But that is who Mike Leach was, and he didn't care what you said. And the year that we got to meet his wife, Sharon, she was so sweet. And I just thought, man, the stories that she must be able to tell living with Mike Leach every day.
Jill Savage, who worked sidelines for the Pac-12 Network for the better part of a decade, who had many, many interactions with Mike Leach, joining us here on 620 Rip City Radio. The other thing that, again, kind of going back to what he did at Washington State and rebuilding, and I think, I don't know if he gets enough credit for the one season where they were in it right up until the Apple Cup, and unfortunately, like, they lost in the snow to the Huskies. But you go back to that offseason, their likely starting quarterback tragically committed suicide that year. Washington said they didn't have a quarterback. He gets this guy named Gardner Minshew that nobody had ever heard of, but out of East Carolina, I think. I think that's where Gardner Minshew came from.
Yeah, Gardner played at 4 different colleges. So
he was JT Daniels before JT Daniels. He was like,
exactly.
Like, JT, hold my beer. I'm going to find a spot. And Gardner Minshew was looking to, if I'm not mistaken, he was looking to be the Alabama graduate assistant, and then had a phone conversation with Mike Leach, and then Washington State would have probably their best year. And talk about, like, keeping a team together under tragic circumstances with a transfer quarterback who nobody had ever heard of that completely changed his life, by the way. And, I mean, I don't know if Mike Leach does get enough credit for that one particular season, because that's amazing coaching right there.
That is amazing coaching. To be able to have a transfer quarterback come in and have things work instantly, it shows you the level of trust that everybody else had in the program already, the culture that Mike Leach had built amongst the players. And I talked to Peyton Pallure, who was the linebacker there that year for Washington State. And I talked to his mom on the field before one of these big homecoming games, and just about how Gardner was able to come in and lead this team the way that he had. It was remarkable. We were, a couple, 5 weeks in or so for the season, and she just said Gardner was a godsend. The fact that he was able to come in and just pick up the pieces that, were not easy to be in that locker room, but just to be the light around everybody and make everybody feel like they were his buddies forever. And, Mike Leach allowed that to happen. Mike called Gardner Minshew up and said, hey, do you want to come lead the nation in passing? Imagine having that phone call from Gardner Minshew, who always believed in himself, who was always the underdog everywhere he went. And then to go out and actually become the nation's leading passer in such a magical year on the Palouse. That is truly the season that I will always remember for Mike Leach. But also the other thing I think that he doesn't get enough credit for is the coaches that he would hire. Now, everybody's talking about the coaching tree since Mike Leach has passed, but I don't think that he gets enough credit for some of the assistants that he would hire. And he would joke with me about how many times am I going to have to hire Oklahoma's next assistant coach, right? Because he coached at Oklahoma. They ran very similar things that Mike Leach did. And they would always just come through and poach all of his coaches. And, Alex Grinch was probably the last one that went there from him and moved on from since then. But he had a way of finding unique talent that would fit his system, whether that was a player like Gardner Minshew or coaches from across the country that he knew would be a really good fit for his system. And you have to be able to marry the two together to have that success like he did on the Palouse.
Well, I mean, yeah, just like you mentioned, kind of the coaching, the coaching connection. He had a quarterback when he was at Texas Tech that he had an open and frank conversation with and said, I don't think you're going to be able to play an awful lot. Have you ever thought about getting into coaching? That quarterback would ultimately become a grad assistant and assistant coach and then move on to be a pretty decent head football coach himself, and his name was Lincoln Riley.
Yeah. Lincoln Riley, I mean, you see what he's able to do and the impact that he says Mike Leach had on his life. And Cliff Kingsbury, We had Graham Harrell as the offensive coordinator at USC for a while. We talked to him. Everybody would just say, Mike Leach, if you were under him, if you were a quarterback, if you were a grad assistant, you learned so much, which is funny because he would never tell us on the outside. But if you were on the inside, he would give all of the secrets over and try and make you as successful as possible. And Lincoln Riley is going to be, ruling college football for quite some time still to come.
Jill Savage, who worked the sidelines for the Pac-12 Network, friend of the program, remembering the legacy of Mike Leach. Hey, Jill, thanks so much for hanging out with us this morning. I know you're in SEC country now, so I don't know if you've been fully indoctrinated, but it's nice to maybe take a trip back to your
really
Pac-12 roots.
Yeah, I don't know if Vanderbilt really counts, Justin.
Yeah, but you're in Nashville. Like all the teams have somebody in Nashville, right?
They do. It's Music City. It's a pretty good place to be.
All right, Jill Savage, hey, thanks so much. Have a terrific time, and if I don't talk to you, have a Merry Christmas, Jill.
You too, Justin. Thanks so much for the time.